Our reading this morning comes from Victoria Moran, a book called Lit from Within, Tending Your Soul for Lifelong Beauty. She writes, "A simple life is not seeing how little we can get by with. That's poverty. But how efficiently we can put first things first. When you're clear about your purpose and your priorities, you can painlessly discard whatever does not support these, whether it's clutter in your cabinets or commitments on your calendar." One of the purposes of ministry is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. You may have heard that before. Well, what I'm about to share this morning is definitely on the afflict the comfortable end of that spectrum. And I think sermons that are designed to afflict the comfortable are usually aimed at the most backsliding, sinful, depraved hypocrites in the room. And far too often that includes myself. So if you start feeling a little afflicted this morning or find yourself squirming in your seat a little, please know that I am right there with you. This is my struggle that I'm sharing with you this morning. I want to start with a story. When our children were small, they were typical kids in that they wanted as much candy and sweets as they could possibly get into their mouths. And we were, I think, typical parents in that we weren't going to have that. We wanted to set a good example of healthy diet and healthy relationships with food. So somewhere along the line, though, one of our kids had an idea. Just for an experiment, just one time, let's have candy for dinner. Candy for dinner. Just imagine. The idea was we would switch dessert and the main course. We'd have candy for dinner and vegetables for dessert. But the usual rules, the rules that were always the same in our family, would still apply. Take as much as you want, as much as you can actually eat. You can have seconds if you want, but don't take anything that you don't think you can finish, because we don't want to waste food in this family either. And you don't get to have dessert until you've finished everything that you took. Pretty normal rules, right? Probably many households have similar rules around dinner time. So we got out the family candy jar and we decided together on carrots and broccoli as the dessert offering. And our kids went nuts. They piled their plates high with the most colorful still life of M&Ms and chocolate bars and Reese's peanut butter cups. It was a childhood fantasy. It was candy for dinner. Before too long, as you can imagine, their stomachs didn't feel so well, and their mouths were coated, with that really sticky over-sweetness. And at some point, one of them was actually begging for some broccoli or some carrots. The dessert, begging for dessert. So this, even, there was no way they were going to finish what was on their plates. But I remember one of them tearfully begging for a carrot. And for many years, I've used that story as a way of illustrating how kids are not that good at considering the consequences of their choices. They're just not that good at planning ahead very well. So, they'll thoughtlessly pile their plates with candy when that's what's on the menu. But in more recent years, I've started to realize that I'm not that much better at it. I don't have much of a high horse to get up on. It's a different sort of equation that I struggle with, and it's usually on a longer time scale than just what I'm putting on my plate. So for example, if you ask a homeless person, what would enough look like in your life? How would you define enough for yourself? What would make it so that you could say, okay, I'm satisfied. Now I have enough. Well, they might say, if I could just have a secure home and a bed to sleep in at night where I'm not constantly being roused by passersby or the police, that would do it. That would be enough. Okay, so if you ask someone who lives in a stable home, what would enough look like for them? They might say, you know, if I could just have a reliable car that would get me back and forth to work without the risk and insecurity of being possibly stranded on the side of the highway, that would do it. That would be enough for me. Okay, so ask a middle-class professional with 2 cars in the garage. What would enough look like to them? And they might say, oh, enough for a secure retirement, enough to know that I'm not going to be destitute sometime after I retire and before I die. You see the pattern here, right? Can we skip right to the top and ask a multi-billionaire? What would enough look like to you, Mr., and they're always Misters, Mr. Multi-billionaire? What would enough look like to you? Well, at least 3 of them have said going to space would be enough for them. So it's clear to me from this pattern that at least for people in our society, maybe for humans in general, we're just not very good at ever being satisfied with what we have. We act like we actually believe that he who dies with the most toys wins. I suspect that in the evolutionary past, most of our human and pre-human ancestors might have defined it as, am I still alive? If I'm still alive, then I have enough. So I have to ask myself, how would I define enough? And here, by enough, I'm talking about wealth, enough comfort, enough convenience. What is enough wealth for me? How much is enough comfort? What is enough convenience for me personally? And when you start to try and figure out what would enough look like for you, you very quickly run into the problem of the difference between wants and needs, right? And when I got to that point, I remembered Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Everybody remember this from your school days? Here it is. You may have seen something like this before. And the bottom level is basic physiological needs, and then safety needs for security and safety, belongingness and love needs, intimate relationships and friends, esteem needs, prestige, feelings of accomplishment, and then up at the top, self-actualization, achieving one's full potential, including creative activities. And then they sort of break them over here on the side, break them into groups: basic needs, psychological needs, and self-fulfillment needs. Recently, I learned that some scholars, this is kind of an aside, but I think it's an important one. Some scholars have pointed out a Eurocentric bias in Maslow's work. They're asking why it's so individualistic. Why self-fulfillment needs at the top? Shouldn't the top levels include something about healthy community life and relationships? Anyhow, so I was thinking about this. I also happened to be having a problem, a decision I had to make involving a lawnmower. So looking at this pyramid, I asked myself, where does a lawnmower fit on Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Nowhere. I mean, you could stretch the argument and say that maybe there's a safety need somewhere in there, but I'm not buying it. I'm not buying it. And yet, almost all of us here in Pennsylvania either have a lawnmower or we pay someone else to use a lawnmower on our behalf, right? So, do I need a lawnmower? I know I don't want a lawnmower, and yet I do have one. So where does a lawnmower fit on Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Well, you only have to go back about 300 years, maybe 400, and even the wealthiest kings and queens didn't have anything like the comfort and luxury that pretty much all of us in this country, at least, now take for granted. When it was hot, on a hot summer day, they were just hot. They just sweated. There was no alternative. So compared to not that long ago, we live lives of incredible luxury and convenience and comfort. So how would you define enough? And more importantly, what would it take for you to answer that question with, I already have enough. This is enough. Do you know anyone who could authentically answer the question that way? My guess is there aren't very many of them. And I want what they're having, however they've managed to get to that point. I think not having a definition of enough is a kind of spiritual depravity. Because if you don't have a definition of enough, you can never be satisfied. Not being able to be satisfied then interferes with my ability to live in a state of gratitude. If we don't define enough, we can't share our surpluses with others because there are no surpluses, right? There are never any surpluses because there's never really enough. We're never really satisfied. It becomes kind of a loop in our thinking and our acquiring. Not having a definition of enough, I think, is a spiritual depravity because it distracts us from the sources of true happiness, true fulfillment. It puts us on a consumerism treadmill that keeps us away from spending time with our families. It keeps us from doing other activities that might actually help us meet the higher levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like belonging, self-actualization. Things, purchases, objects, they can't do that. They can't provide that for us. Not having a definition of enough is a spiritual depravity because our comforts and our conveniences have costs. Our culture of consumerism has habituated us, at least for middle-class Americans, to a habit of offloading our discomforts and inconveniences onto others. It's depraved because it requires a certain level of self-deception in order to remain comfortable, especially emotionally comfortable. We have to blind ourselves to those costs that we ask others to bear for us. Let me give you just a few examples. When it's really hot in the summertime and my house is filled with the discomfort of heat and humidity, I sometimes switch on the air conditioner. What that machine literally does is it removes heat and humidity from the inside of my house and it dumps it outside my house. It can't just make it cold in there. The laws of thermodynamics say that you can't do that. The heat has to go somewhere. So the air conditioner puts it outside of my house where it raises the heat and humidity for every other creature and person that doesn't have air conditioning. That includes my neighbor, who simply can't afford an air conditioner, but also all the wildlife that lives out there. Now, if I lived out in the middle of a forest somewhere with not many other people, that heat and humidity that I put it out there would be negligible. But if I live in the suburbs or in the city, me switching on my air conditioner contributes to the heat island effect. Cities are warmer than the surrounding countryside because of things like that. It's measurable, and it literally makes everyone else who doesn't have air conditioning more uncomfortable. They are bearing the cost of my comfort when I turn that thing on. And that's totally aside from the climate impact of making the electricity to run the air conditioner. Another example. I happen to really enjoy the cordless convenience of having the whole world of information right here in my pocket. And when it comes time for me to get a new phone or a new battery for my phone, I might prefer not to know or not to remember that the cordlessness of this thing requires a battery, or that the battery requires a certain amount of cobalt. About a third of the world cobalt supply comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where UNICEF estimates that the cobalt mining there is done largely by about 40,000 children. My comfort and convenience. Those children are working in extremely hazardous, sometimes lethal conditions. I'd rather not think about that when it comes time to getting a new phone. I like perfect red apples with no spots on them. And as Joni Mitchell sang back in the 1960s, give me spots on my apples, but leave me the birds and the bees. Well, when I buy those apples, those perfect round red apples, I am offloading the spots onto the birds and the pollinators. And, you know, maybe we don't use DDT anymore, but we're still using something, right? We're still using something that prevents the natural processes that cause these little minor cosmetic blemishes to not be there. And pollinators are in steep decline the last few years. And when pollinators are in trouble, we all are. Not having a definition of enough security leads us to look the other way while our nation wages drone warfare. And when we do that, I am offloading the dirty work, the moral injury and the PTSD onto my fellow Americans, people who are just trying to serve their country. I haven't even mentioned the targets of those drone strikes. Talk about offloading. I could go on with examples. Cheap meat, border patrols, palm oil, lumber, all of these comforts and conveniences and low prices involve me offloading my discomfort and my inconvenience onto others, other people or natural ecosystems. So how do we go about defining enough? Well, I came across one approach last summer. I heard a talk by Chuck Fowler, now a friend of mine and a retired fisheries researcher. Chuck spent his career really taking an in-depth look at the interconnected food web of marine ecosystems. That was his job. And at some point along the line, he realized that humans are actually part of that web because we're taking some of our food from the sea, along with other predators like dolphins and seals. And we occupy a niche that should be kind of similar to that of dolphins and seals because we eat the same things and our bodies are about the same size as ours. They're similar predators when it comes to placement in a food web. So Chuck made these graphs of how much biomass is used, is consumed by each of the species in the marine food web, focusing on the species that are most similar to us, dolphins and seals and so on. And what he found is that he had to graph these things on logarithmic axes because we are consuming 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 times as much as dolphins and seals consume. So one approach to defining enough might be, at least on a global scale, would be to ask ourselves, what do other similar species consume, and try to limit ourselves to that, fit in a similar niche ecologically. That would give us a guideline for how much we could be consuming if we were in a sustainable food web, instead of just broadly taking everything as we are now. And we're broadly taking everything because we don't have a definition of enough. And now we're facing the consequences of that lack. Not getting enough water. Our cravings are infinite. If we don't have a definition of enough, our cravings are infinite, and the earth is finite. And I play a role in that. You know, it's not enough for me to just blame big business. It's easy, too easy, to point my finger and say, well, big business has to take care of this because they're the ones that are, you know, scraping the bottom of the ocean to get every last fish out of there. But they're doing it because I pay them to do it, right? I can't just abdicate my responsibility as a consumer for paying big business to do my dirty work. So the question remains, how do I define enough? And it's made harder by the fact that I'm bombarded with advertising 24/7. That same global information source is almost exclusively funded by advertising, right? Advertisers, they know human psychology. They're scientists. They know what motivates us, and they make use of that, which is a real hindrance when it comes to defining enough for myself, especially enough purchases. And with big data now, they're able to get pretty specific. They know what motivates J.D. Stillwater, and they can make use of that. This phone here is about 6 years old, and I'm sure they know that. So I saw an ad recently that was just really blatant. It's a big block letters on my screen that said, "You deserve a new phone." And the first time I saw it, it was like, but I like my phone. And what is this deserve stuff? You don't even know me. But, after a while, after seeing the same ad over and over again, it's like, oh, those new phones do have much better cameras than this one, and I could use a little more storage, and advertising works. It really works. So how do we define enough? How do we even begin? We live in a society that encourages us to have candy for dinner 24/7. And it's killing us. And it's killing the earth. How much comfort and convenience is enough? What will it take for each of us, and for me specifically, to be okay with more broccoli and spinach in my consuming? Jimmy Carter asked us decades ago, what will it take to just turn down the thermostat and put on a sweater? And he lost the election because of that. He's going to... Sorry, I didn't expect to get emotional on this part. Jimmy's going to turn 98 on October 1st. 98. You gotta love that man. Well, one possibility that I want to suggest to all of us this morning, myself included, is to flip the question upside down. Instead of defining enough wealth, comfort, and convenient, what if we defined enough belonging, enough serenity, enough supportive community, natural beauty, spirituality? How much time with your loved ones would be enough? How many close friends is enough? How much natural beauty is enough? How much free time is enough? What if we prioritized these higher order needs and aligned our consumption habits to work in support of those? I'm told that every good sermon has an action step, something people can take home and run with and maybe make a difference in your life. Now that I'm no longer teaching in a classroom, I'm going to give you some homework. So here it comes. I'm going to ask several things of you. Number one, write down, sometime in the next couple days, but maybe right after the service would be a convenient time while you're still thinking about it. Write down some things that are important to you that money can't buy. And ask yourself what it would take to get enough of those. And then, before putting things in your, I'm sorry, I'm not quite at number 2 yet. Before putting things into your holiday shopping cart, ask yourself how you could structure your holidays to maximize the things money can't buy. You may find that what you lose by prioritizing those higher order things is no loss at all. Number 2 is, go ahead and take a stab at defining enough wealth, comfort, and convenience for yourself. And try to shoot for an answer that's durable, something that would still be true for you if you won the lottery or got some kind of major promotion. What costs and discomforts can you take back and carry on your own? Honestly, I would love to hear what you come up with, because as I said, I'm struggling with this too. It's fine if our definitions are all different. They probably will be. But the conversation itself, talking amongst yourselves and with your neighbors and friends and with me, if you care to, I think that conversation itself might lead to something profound, something really that changes our lives in some significant way, something that allows us to feel more satisfied, more grateful, and more part of a beloved community that we all seek but really struggle to create. Let's get better at handling this candy for dinner economy of ours. Let's get better at afflicting the comfortable, especially when it's ourselves. Let's learn to behave like the one who dies with the most love wins. Thank you for letting me share my struggles with you this morning. Amen, and blessed be.